Hey guys, I miss your faces. This is our last video for the semester. I know it's pretty sad. And so I want to talk about I Sing the Body Electric by Walt Whitman. This is a poem, probably pretty long. If you're like, oh, I'm just gonna read this quick little poem. No, Walt Whitman was never quick, in anything he wrote. And I like this poem specifically because this was, to me, kind of a transcendental poem where he talks about the connectedness of the body to the soul. And so he basically says you can't have one without the other. And look at how beautiful this body is and how electric it is. So this poem had a million different drafts. It was originally published in 1855, and then I think it had its last publishing or its last change in 1867. So it got changed a lot in this time. And so let's talk about it a little bit. A couple things that are funny. Let's just go through it like number by number. Some of them are more important than others, and so sometimes there's a couple things that I want you to notice, and sometimes I'm like, oh, let's look at this. Not all of those though, so you guys don't stress too much. But so he starts talking about how he sings the body. And so one thing that's really funny is this word in girth. If you decided to look it up, you might see that there really was he wrote this word, he created this word. And so we kind of have to take it from context what it means. And whenever I look at that, I think wrap around. And so I think he's talking about how the bodies and spirits of the people he loves wrap around him. And there is sex in this poem, but I don't think it's here. We'll talk about the sex because I know that's the reason people stay around. A couple things about Walt Whitman. He was bisexual. So if you were reading this and you said, oh, there seems like there's sexual attraction to men and women in here, there absolutely was. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So basically, I would say part one, he's just talking about that connection to the body and the soul. Okay, so part two, there's just a couple things that I want to point out. If you look at most of this, it's really about workers, and I'm talking about how they talk about girls, mothers, housekeepers. He talks about people wrestling, but it's all people going to work. And so that's one thing that I think is kind of important about that, because he's seeing the beauty in everyday things. And he's, you can almost picture him looking out his window and seeing like the morning when people were going to work and how he saw these people and he was talking about their bodies. And I don't want you to get weird about that, because people are like, oh, they were talking about bodies. Not necessarily in a way that's like, oh, he's kind of stalkery. I think he's just looking at it and seeing the beauty in it. But there is a little bit of sexuality in here, so we'll talk about that. I see a couple little things in here where he's talking about a man walking by, and he says, you see, to see him pass conveys as much as the best poem, perhaps more. You linger to see his back and the back of his neck and shoulder side. And when we think about this idea of lingering, what we have is just looking almost a little too long. And so I think about that there. And so I think it's kind of interesting too, when he kind of has some of these repetitive words that are a little bit, I would think, a little bit sexual. And I think some of it's the wrestlers that really kind of got me. The overhold, the underhold. I was like, ooh, that's kind of interesting there. So I think that's kind of fun too. But for the most part, I think he's looking at the beauty of just people in ordinary situations doing ordinary things and sexualizing it a tad. Okay, so three. Three is one of my very favorites. We've gone from this kind of conversation about people to workers, and now we have a conversation about one man, an old farmer. And I think it's kind of interesting because we look at this guy and he really is very strong and very loved. And so there's a couple things that I think are worth talking about here. He said, I used to go and visit him to see him. He was wise also. So up to here, they have only really described what he looks like. And then whenever he went to see him, he said he was wise also. Like, that wisdom is almost an afterthought. And I think that's kind of interesting, because a lot of times when we think of older people, the first thing we think about is their wisdom. And so he's kind of turning that on its head and saying, oh, he was wise also. And there's another thing that I think, or actually, there's a couple things that I think are interesting about that one. They did not love him by allowance. They loved him with personal love. And that's everybody who knew him, his daughters, everybody who knew him loved him. And they didn't love him just because they had to, because he was their dad or he was this guy. They loved him because they truly loved him. Personal love, not love like you say it but you don't mean it. They truly do. And I think that's really beautiful, and I think that it's really cool that he makes that kind of he differentiates the two things, that I love somebody because I have to versus really really loving someone. Last thing that's kind of interesting, so we go through this. First we have I knew, and then basically they're describing him in third person. But then the thing that's really interesting to me here is that it switches to second person, which is you. And so what he says here is you would pick him out as the most beautiful and vigorous of the gang. And then there's this really interesting last line. You would wish long and long to be with him. You would wish to sit by him in that boat, and that you and he might touch each other. For years, my students have been like, what does this mean? Well, I don't know. Some people say it is sexual, and they're like, oh, that's weird. Why would they sexualize this old person? Well, I mean, in some ways, why not? Like, he's just looking at people who aren't necessarily sexualized. So there's that. And then people say maybe there's a different meaning for touch, and that touch might be more of that kind of spiritual touch the effect that we have on each other. Like, it was a touching poem. It was a touching card. Anyway, so it could mean that too. And I don't really feel like I have to encourage you to feel either way. I think you'll see what you want. But I just want to tell you it was out there. Now, I think this is one of the more simple ones, so I'm not going to go over it too much, but it's basically just the conversation of being around people. And I think it's kind of interesting because there's this one line: to be around beautiful, curious, breathing, laughing flesh. Ugh, that word sounds weird because he's like taking all these things: beauty, curiosity, laughing, and then he says flesh, which he's like almost talking about like a body part versus all this other kind of abstract ideas. So I think he does that throughout, that he kind of combines the abstract things that the body can do with the kind of concrete things that the body is. So that's kind of fun too. And so really this one though is just talking about how it's beautiful to be around people and to hear them, to maybe touch them, to smell them. And I think that's kind of interesting, especially now because we can't be around anybody. So I think Walt Whitman would probably be really, really sad during the time of Corona. So moving on. Now, if you guys said, whoa, I made it to 5, and I was like, what is happening here? Yeah, there is sex all over this thing. You guys, it gets a little nasty. So this one's so great to me though, because he's talking about the female form and there's like sex right from the beginning. And I think we have to look at this line. I am drawn by its breath as if I were no more than a helpless vapor. I mean, that's great. He wants to be a vapor that's breathed in by this woman that he loves. And he's basically saying all this stuff, books, art, religion, none of it matters. Even fear of heaven and hell doesn't matter right now because he's about to have some sex. Okay? And so let's just go ahead and say, I mean, like, ebb stung by the flow, flow stung by the ebb. I mean, that is love, flesh swelling. It is what you think it is. And it gets worse, you guys. And every time we read this, my students are like, whoa, yeah. Limitless lipid jets of love and quivering jelly, white blow. This is sex. This is sex that's happening. And so if you're like, was this a sex scene? Absolutely it was. Now, I want you to think about this though. Again, we're talking about the female form, the female body. So we have all this sex. But then it seems like it really, really moves on. This is the nucleus. So what we start out with a sex scene, but then we end up with a child. And basically, I think this is so interesting because it kind of starts out with this thing that maybe this is the place where he was kind of the most controversial, but then he comes back around and he's like, but from that controversy comes this beautiful thing. And there's a couple things that I think are maybe a little dated because he's like, be not ashamed, women, which pregnancy was more of a shameful thing back in the 1800s. I mean, that was even in the 1950s. So I think that's kind of interesting, but it talks about the female body, sex, birth, motherhood, and then it almost brings it right back around to that sex scene again. And so I want to look at this last line where he says, I see my soul reflected in nature as I see through the mist. And then it says he sees bent head and arms folded over the breast, the female I see. So we know earlier from this sex scene that it was probably a marriage night, or a wedding night, excuse me, because it says bridegroom of night. And so this is a sex scene, but it was kind of I would say a tame sex scene, really. And then we look at this idea of this person who's not sure of themselves, a woman who is folded, it says her hands are folded over her breast, like she doesn't want that person who she's having sex with to see her for the first time. And so there's like in this piece there is innocence, shame, sex, creating humanity, and then it goes back to this idea of innocence. And so it's so interesting how he gives power to the woman, he shows her, and then he shows how on that night that she had sex for the first time, she would be scared and maybe even ashamed of her body. So I think that's really fascinating. One of my favorites. I mean, The Farmer's my favorite, but I really like this one too. 6 it's fun, but really it's basically talking about how we are all sacred, and how we can't know who someone's going to be. So he talks about people who are ignorant. He talks about people who are, he says, dull-faced immigrants who landed on the wharf, and I'm thinking like Ellis Island. I think that's what we're talking about here. But he's basically saying that everybody has their place. And so we look at people oftentimes and we think probably this person either doesn't belong or this person maybe isn't as good as me. And he's saying, shut up. Of course they are as good as you. They all belong in this procession. And he says the universe is a procession. So I think that's really, really beautiful. And he's basically saying we should accept everyone. Okay, couple things with 7. I think this is really fun because this is, well, it's not fun, but this is where he talks about a man's body at auction. So we have to think about the time period. 1855 was the first time it was written. It's basically talking about slavery here. And I think it's kind of interesting because we have to think of a slave auction here, but he says the auctioneer does not half know his business. Basically saying that this person who I guess is used to valuing a body at a price, doesn't know his business at all. And he's basically saying he couldn't know because all he's doing is selling the kind of physical part. And so then he says, we have the same blood. We basically have the same senses. And he says that this slave is the father of kings later, and the kings can be fathers of slaves later. So I think it's kind of interesting here, basically saying, things change, the world changes. And so it's just like kind of looking at that. And again, I think there's kind of that idea of no one is better than anyone else. Now, you may have felt like 8 was also the story of a body, of slavery, but it's not. A woman's body at auction, if we think about another way that a woman's body can be sold, you may hop to prostitution. And I think that is what this one's talking about. And I think more than that, I think we can see it a little bit more when we talk about corruption and what it means to corrupt a body. And my students have such an interesting conversation about that, because some people are like, oh, to have a tattoo, you corrupt your body. And then I'm like, well, what about glasses or dyeing your hair or eating too much or smoking cigarettes? There's all kinds of things that can be corrupt. So more than anything, I don't have an answer to it. So maybe think about what you see as corruption and how you can't conceal that idea. Okay. And then 9. 9 is not one of my favorites, but it's kind of fun. So 9 is the one that just lists all the body parts. And that's fun. A lot of people don't like reading this one because you're just like, ribs, belly, backbone, joints of backbone, hips, hip sockets. But the thing that are kind of fun in here is that it's not all body parts. Inside this are these kind of abstract concepts, all attitudes, all shapeliness, all belongings. I think that's kind of interesting. But I love the one where we have my brain in its skull frame. But then sympathies is not part of your body. Heart valves is, palate valves aren't. Sexuality, yeah and no. Maternity,